When people from Western countries talk about poverty, they use words like GDP per capita to try to convince you that Africa is poor. In fact, according to such measurements, Africa is the poorest place in the world and maybe the entire universe. But the question still remains, is Africa real poor? To answer that question in this video, I want to try to sway you with quotations like, oh, Africa is very rich because it has natural resources, minerals, rich history, and more. That makes a weak argument. But the purpose is to dive deeper about poverty in Africa and how it comes to be. Who measures it? And how do they measure it? And then, why do imperialists keep using such fraud measurements about African growth and development? Does it benefit them when they keep saying Africa is poor? To elaborate the problem of measuring economic growth with measurements like GDP, I have an example to use to illustrate the point for us to really understand. Imagine these two people. A. John is a school teacher who earns about $500 a month. John lives in a town where he pays all expenses through bank transactions. All John's expenses include rent, food, and transport are both paid with a bank or digital currency. And for that fact, the government knows all about John's earning and expenditure, and it helps the government to plan effectively. B. Samuel is a subsistence farmer who has about 4 cows, 15 goats, and over 200 hens. Samuel has a house he built himself where all his family lives with him. Samuel gets food to feed his family from his farm, he gets water from the rain he collects, and he uses charcoal and wood as the source of his fuel. Plus, some solar on his roof for lighting and charging his phone. Samuel, in all terms, is self-reliant. The only thing he buys are a few things he can't produce by himself, like salt, sugar, coffee, oil, a few spices, and other items, which brings his monthly expenditure about $20. With these two examples, it's very easy to know who is richer than the other, right? Right? Well, no. In statistics, Samuel is the poorest and John is the richest. A great appreciation being that John's economic activities are formal, regulated, and transactional, which means it's very easy for the government to track down his earnings, consumptions, investments, and more. And Samuel's economic activities are very informal and hard to track, which makes him the poorest. But it's very easy to see that Samuel is 10 times better off than John. Then, why say John is the richest? Why not count Samuel's assets as real wealth? Why? Why? Well, the short answer is that modern measures of economy like GDP, PPP, HDI index don't want to, or at least try not to. These measurements focus on things like consumption, investments, government spending, income, rent, wages, and more, while ignoring non-market activities, sustainability, non-monetary factors, and more. Now your question might be, how does all this relate to the real poverty in Africa? You might as well say,
if you say that Africa is not poor, why is it plagued with diseases, lack of infrastructure, and much more? If GDP was wrong, then why isn't life in Africa better?
Well, the answer is, if the true data is not collected and the real African economy is misunderstood, it becomes harder to develop policies that are effective in making African economies grow. And the problem of bad data about African's economy is out of hand. Yes, everything you know about African economy is wrong. Yes, you have heard me right. Every GDP, wrong. PPP, wrong. HDI index, wrong. And all data about African economy is made up and wrong because they are based on estimates. In his book, Poor Numbers, How We Are Misled by African Development, Morton Saven argues that ranking of African economies according to GDP levels shouldn't be taken at face value. In large part, the information recorded in databases is the result of automatic data permutations, preliminary estimates, or neglected numbers. And why would such be the case to base the whole of African economy on estimates and guesses? Well, because of how African economy is. Mon continues with the revelation that in most African economies, the unrecorded economy is so large and therefore so uneconomically important that to leave it unrecorded is unsatisfactory. And what does Mon mean by unrecorded economy? He is referring to an informal economy. Yes, Africa has the most enormous informal economies in the world, with IMF estimating that the share of informal employment averages 60% total of non-agricultural employment, and in some African countries having more than 90% of their economies being informal. The biggest setback of informal economies is that these economies don't really work with the measures of development that modern economists use, including per capita and its variants, because these focus on only formal trackable data. But does that mean that if you don't count it, then it doesn't exist? Well, let me give you an example. Human population is informal and hard to count, but does that mean that countries should never know about their population? You already know the answer. Yes, countries do census to get the exact number of their population. Meaning, yes, these countries with informal sectors should also do census about informal sectors to include their rich citizens like Samuel, which is not the case in Africa, which leaves African economies unaccountable for and based on estimates. The question is Africa real poor? Well, the short answer is that yes. If you measure development using GDP, per capita and such measurements, yes, Africa is ridiculously poor. However, that doesn't paint the whole picture of the real African economy, which is in large extent dependent on estimates, which means that either African economies are underestimated or overestimated, but the former being highly likely. Who wants Africa poor? The question now becomes, why is it so? Why not collect and get real accurate data? For starters, there is no incentive to report that Africa is doing better or having a strong economy. In fact, the opposite is the best, as keeping Africa poor, even on paper, benefits a lot. Yes, from incompetent and authoritarian African governments that would avoid accountability with real growth and also saying Africa is poor to keep extortion of aid from foreign nations for their own greed and corruption, to multinationals that exploit natural resources and labor, to even groups like World Bank and IMF who keep giving African loans at the highest interest rate since the economies are regarded as poor and risky. Then keeping Africa poor even on paper benefits a lot of these imperialists than reporting the real economy of Africa. So what should Africans do? As usual, we have to get informed and educated, as this will highlight the real problems that we are facing so that we can put all these resources to fight and solve these problems. And in this video, what we had was the poor data of African economy that imperialists and dictators use to exploit us. So to help, share this video with the people you know would be interested to learn, and one day we shall win. Thanks for watching.